Wherever you are in the world, welcome. My name is Matthew Griffin. I am the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute, a global futures and deep futures think tank looking at over 600 exponential and emerging technologies, investigating the impact of hundreds of different megatrends on global business, culture and society across the next 50 years. And in this particular keynote, I'm going to be talking about the risks that we face at an individual level, an organizational level, a societal level, and a global level. Now, for those of you that know me, I'm very enthusiastic about democratizing access to the future, where the future is information and points of view and so on and so forth. Now, this particular presentation was first delivered in London to a private bank, and it's centered on the UK. So what we do is we have a look at we have a look at a lot of the global trends that we're seeing today, and then we extrapolate out what are they, why should we care, and then we bring it back down to a United Kingdom level. Now, if you aren't from the UK, you can kind of ignore the United Kingdom level, but some of the trends that we see and their impacts on a sovereign nation actually relate to any country that you happen to be in. So, with no further ado, this is what I'm going to be talking about. Now, we're going to be talking about future foundations. We're going to be having a look at what I call the law of four. We're going to be having a look at the macro view. So that's just really everything. And then we're going to be bringing it back down to steep risks. So these are societal, technological, economic, environmental and political risks. And I'm going to explain how these risks that we're seeing, I'm going to explain what they are, why they're important, why we should care, and then the impact on really the UK, as I explained, but different countries. And then we're going to summarize things out. So when we actually have a look at today's environment, it is very easy to argue that we live in the most complex business environment ever. We have high rates of inflation, we have supply chain crunches, we're coming off the back of a pandemic, we have war, we have increased political activism, we have the increasing rise basically of a bipolar and then eventually multipolar world, which is creating its own economic and political and cultural tensions and so on and so forth. And then there's us, somewhere in the middle, individuals trying to figure out what's going on, what it means to us at an individual level or an organizational level, and so on and so forth. That's what I'm here for. Now, when we have a look at all the trends and all the technologies that I'm going to be talking about, I make all of these freely available to you. So if you scan this particular QR code, it will take you to the 311institute.com website. And if you go to the codexes section, these codexes are about this thick. They contain information on absolutely anything and everything that you care about and lots of things that you probably don't care about, but they're definitely worth a read. Now, from a UK perspective, I did say this is going to be a little bit UK centric. I travel around the world. Last year I was in 60 different countries. I sit down with the governments of all G7, G20 and quite a lot of the G77 plus. I sit down with the vast majority of multinationals. In fact, my clients' products, you're using them right now basically just to watch this. They're in your pockets, they're in your hands. Basically, you are going to be using my clients' products and services irrespective of really where you are on the planet today. So I get this kind of behind the scenes view of what governments are doing and how they're thinking, including China. Yes, that one. I also get a view from the boardroom, and then I get a global view and I get a regional view. So my belief is that from a UK perspective, the UK government and the UK's execution is flawed. Its vision is flawed. And we are punching well below our weight as a G7 country in terms of what we can do for our own society, what we can do for the world at large. And that's across different industries as well. And when I have a look at the policies that are actually being put in place, and then in some cases being rolled back, I think that increasingly the United Kingdom faces a future where it is sidelined, not at the heart of the conversations that we care about. Now, when we have a look at the law of four, now what I mean by the law of four is when we're trying to extrapolate out near, medium and deeper futures, there is so much in play. As I explained, there are hundreds of emerging technologies that change everything. There are hundreds of mega trends that change everything. You combine these things together or converge them if we use that particular term. And what we have is we have an infinite number of futures. And then as a futurist, it's really down to us to try to identify the plausible, possible, preferable, preposterous futures and all those kinds of different things, with what most organizations and governments want is some form of accuracy. So one of the ways that I do this is I look for what I call anchoring constants. And if you download the books, you can read more about this particular concept. But when we actually have a look at the economy, irrespective of how the economy is actually grown, we know that the general purpose, the constant, whether it's today or 100 years into the future of the economy, is we want to acquire resources, we need competition, so we need to compete, and it's generally me versus you for whatever I'm up to, and we need to create revenues and we need to generate profit. So from an economy perspective, whether it's humans at the helm of companies or whether it's artificial intelligence driving companies, we know that in 100 years' time, companies will be driven to create profit, etc. So hopefully you sort of get the idea. Now, when we have a look at things from an ecological perspective, we know that nature itself is very adaptable. Increasingly, nature will find balance. So it doesn't really matter what we do to the planet, whether we heat it up, cool it down, etc., etc. Nature itself will always try to find balance, unlike humans. And then we have the laws of natural selection, where as the environment around us changes, nature selects what animals go where through natural evolution. Then we have humans. Now, there are a lot of constants with humans, but we're adaptable. Basically, we're emotional. So, for example, if we have a political leader in another country that gets incredibly cross, basically, at somebody, then we understand that that particular emotion will probably reflect negatively in the policies that he or she actually create, and so on and so forth. But we also have self-preservation. And then we have things like values, and we have lots of different constants when we come to humans, such as needs and wants, consumerism, etc. And then technology. Increasingly, technology basically is trying to automate things by being increasingly efficient. We know basically that we see cost depreciation basically within technology. So technology generally gets cheaper over time and its performance gets better over time. We know that technology is increasingly pervasive, and in the future we see technology being more central to everything that we do rather than less. So again, that's a constant. But it's also increasingly super-exponential. Now, when we talk about exponential technologies, we often think about things like Moore's law, where there is a doubling in computer power every 18 months. Now, that's coming under stress. But what we mean by super-exponential is when we have a look at artificial intelligence, recent developments in artificial intelligence haven't been doubling, for example, every year. They've been quintupling every couple of days. So we are moving from kind of exponential squared to exponential cubed and all those different things. So this is what I mean when we have a look at technology. Technology is in some cases is becoming super exponential, because frankly there is no actual word to really describe what happens when something goes more than exponential. We call them exponents basically in maths. It just doesn't sound as much fun. Now, when we have a look at the macro view of the world, firstly we actually have three real worlds. We also have three kinds of economy. We have the physical economy, we have the digital economy, and we have the virtual economy. Now, when we have a look at the physical economy, that is where Adidas, for example, can sell you a sneaker. When we have a look at the digital economy, that's where Adidas, again, for example, sell you a runtastic running subscription And when we have a look at the virtual economy, this is where Adidas sell you a virtual sneaker that you can wear in your virtual environments. So virtual reality environments and so on and so forth. Now, I see these all as being distinctly different. Virtual isn't digital. Digital isn't obviously physical. So that means that from an entrepreneur's perspective, but also from a global perspective and a government point of view, we should really be thinking about how we maximize our opportunities in the physical, digital, and virtual spaces. Because in Adidas's case, they've gone from being able to sell you one product to three. And it's actually a lot more than three, but you kind of get the idea. I've just tripled your market opportunity. And when we have a look at the virtual space, that's estimated to be a $12 trillion opportunity as it is anyway. And all of these contribute to global GDP growth, which by 2050 we think will have doubled. And 80% of that global GDP we estimate will be coming from about 32 different countries. Now, we also need to be very careful when we think about global mega trends. We need to be very careful about our own inherent biases. Now, as someone who lives in the United Kingdom, I look out into the world, and as we see the rise of the bipolar world, where we used to have America calling all the shots, but increasingly China basically is sort of muscling in, as its economy grows and as it finds its, shall we say, voice on the global stage. From a Western perspective, we can actually look at the world and think the world is splitting. But actually, if you're in India, in the BRICS, for example, or Saudi Arabia, or China, or even Russia, or South Africa, you might have a different view because you don't see the world splitting. You see the world regrouping. And it's these kinds of cultural nuances, basically, that I feel are very important when we're actually trying to do our best to understand how different things and different systems change. But when we actually have a look at this splitting world, if I use the Western vantage point, then we're actually increasingly seeing a world that is splitting along cultural lines, economic lines, in terms of we see new payment rails coming through, we see new digital currencies coming through with the likes of the BRICS, which leads to things like de-dollarization, which we'll get to. We see political splitting. So, for example, we see quite a lot of authoritarian regimes actually clumping together. We see democratic regimes clumping together. So we have a political splitting. And then we have a technological splitting because in the case, for example, of China, they understood that one of the things that made America great from a GDP perspective and from a stature perspective was technology. Now, it's all very well to develop technology, but actually, if you really want to be in the driving seat, you need to develop the technology standards, which is why when we have a look at things like the IEEE consortiums and a lot of the international technology standards bodies, we see a lot more people coming from China to actually sit on those boards and those bodies. So there's a lot of splitting happening. And then, of course, the internet itself is splitting. So are we splitting or are we regrouping? What's your point of view? Now, when we have a look at economic risks, there are substantial economic risks at a global level and actually at a national level. Now, when we have a look at wealth, at the moment, the headline cost of living from an inflation perspective globally is 6.9%. Now, within that, we've actually got a range. We have some countries in Africa that are actually experiencing deflation. So they see -11. So these are countries like Guinea, for example. But then we see other countries that are experiencing inflation rates of 204%. And the fact of the matter is, when you actually have a look at the cost of living from an inflationary perspective, it's at a global level, it's never been higher. Now, on the one hand, what does this mean? So it means that people actually have less disposable income and they have less spending power. And that applies to any country basically that you're in, but obviously, again, we're being a little bit more UK-centric with the next sort of piece. And in the UK, this means that for the past 2 years in a row, we have seen our living standards falling by 5% per year. Never happened before. And a consequence of that is that we see a lot more strikes. So one of my clients basically is KPMG, and they track the number of strikes and protests around the world. And actually, when you have a look at the UK, it's kind of like very few strikes, and then all of a sudden in 2023, it goes like that. I think basically they charted something like almost 2,500 different strike activities basically in the UK in 2023. So a high cost of living means that we see more social unrest, we see living standards falling, and we see a pressure on disposable incomes. Now, when we have a look at global debt levels, basically thanks to the pandemic, where a lot of governments basically were having to borrow heavily in order to support themselves and their economies, public sector debt now stands at an all-time high of $120 trillion. The United States accounts for about $32 trillion of that. They're one of the most heavily indebted countries on the planet. But private debt, so that's sort of citizen debt almost, is $144 trillion. Again, record highs. And of course, as we all know with debt, you've got to pay it back somehow. Now, when we actually have a look at the UK is quite interesting against the global stage, because in the UK in 2023, the debt to income level for each individual in each household was the lowest since 2004. Which means that as we start seeing the economy recover, UK households are actually quite well positioned to come out of that quite well and then go off and start spending again. So the UK economy in that respect is much more robust than many other economies around the world. But it also means basically that we actually see leaner household finances, because if we are carrying so much of a debt burden at a global level, we've got to pay it back. There's very high interest rates basically on a lot of this debt as well. And at some point, we need to cut back our household spending. Now, when we have a look at global GDP, in 2023, we saw an estimated global GDP growth of 2.2% to 3%. And really, organizations like the IMF, for example, and many others, are now saying that in part because of the pandemic and supply chain crunches and wars and everything else, they're now saying that this is the lost economic decade. So that's quite concerning. If you think about the amount of poverty that we have in the world and the difference that we could have actually made had we not had the pandemic, had things elsewhere gone differently, this wouldn't have been a lost decade, but increasingly it is. Now, when we actually have a look at the UK's view as we kind of head to 2030, we estimate that the UK will have a GDP of $3.6 trillion, and it will be a G10 country. Now, as we head slightly outside of 2030, so 2030 to 2035, the UK will start becoming G11 and start sliding down the rankings, which brings me back to what I originally said. I think that the UK, from a visionary perspective, from an execution perspective, is punching well below its weight. Anyway, rant over. Now, from a UK perspective, what we've been trying to do at a government level is focus on digital, so growing digital industries. These are typically service industries and so on and so forth, but also green growth. Now, Rishi Sunak recently reversed quite a lot of his green promises. So really, from a UK perspective, even though globally we're actually seen as a green leader, we're actually now kind of shedding that wagon and saying our debt levels are too high. We know basically there are good green jobs. We know that from an export perspective, we could be building businesses now that are giant in the future, etc., etc., etc. But we're going to double back down basically on digital. And that is bad, because the UK service industry, as well as the global service industry, we see a way for that to be completely eaten by artificial intelligence, which is something I will talk about in a bit. But from a UK perspective, we also see London being the largest part of the UK economy, so no surprises there, with Glasgow in Scotland being the second largest part of the UK economy. So, when we actually have a look at global reserve currency wars as well, there's all kinds of things going on here. Now, on the one hand, you have, we won't say blocks because it's a little bit too generic, but there are certain countries basically that are very keen to undermine the dollar as being the global reserve currency of the world. So obviously Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, South Africa a little bit as well. So when we actually have a look at attempts basically to de-dollarize the world, you know, we've seen the BRICS actually sort of getting larger as an economic bloc. So we saw Saudi Arabia joining recently, Ethiopia joining as well. So those are actually quite significant from a futures perspective, by the way, because Ethiopia actually has got a lot of gas in its tank for a variety of reasons. But when we actually have a look at these global reserve currency wars, if we start seeing more momentum building up, which we are, and we start, for example, with the petro-yuan, the impact of de-dollarization will be felt on the global financial markets. So the global financial markets will become more volatile. There will be new market opportunities. But again, from not just a UK perspective, but a broader country perspective, that's going to affect the value of your pensions and your investment portfolios. And the general consensus, if you have a look at Wall Street, is if de-dollarization is successful, it will wipe out a lot of investments. So that's something to pay attention to, maybe not worry too much about at the moment, but actually everywhere I go in the world, this is a topic of conversation. Now, when we have a look at international migration from a European perspective in 2030, it's estimated that it's going to increase between 21 to 44%. Now, it's a very big range, admittedly. Now, immigration is kind of coming from two places at the moment. So we've got economic migration and we've got environmental migration. So economic migration is simply where people are looking for a better life, you know, outside of refugees and war, that sort of stuff. And they are obviously looking for a much better life as well. But economic migration is, I want to go to that country because that country is richer and I can earn more, roughly. When we have a look at environmental migration, that's slightly different. That's like the Maldives, basically saying, where we live is now under the sea, and so we have to move out of wherever it is that we are. You know, if we have a look at the devastating floods in Pakistan, that will kick off a surge of environmental-based migrations as well, and so on and so forth. But from a UK and from a European perspective, again, this means that we will continue to see increasing migrant pressure. It's the same for the United States as well. The number of migrants, basically, that are going to be trying to get into particular countries and particular blocks is only going to go one way. And that's going to put huge pressure on society. So it's going to put economic pressure on society because on the one hand, these societies will need to be able to absorb migrants and then be able to, should we say, care for them and look after them, yeah, in the most appropriate way. But it's also going to lead to more social unrest, as we've seen really across the planet. And this social unrest, on the one hand, is going to be fueled by increasingly polarized views. It's also going to be fueled by misinformation and disinformation, which again, I will come to in a bit, because all of this stuff is related. Now, when we have a look at wealth inequality, I'm often asked as I go around the world, in the future, do we solve wealth inequality? Now, unfortunately, my answer is kind of no. And the reason for that is this. Firstly, the way that we build businesses today is very different to the way that we build businesses, we built businesses 50 years ago. Now, what I mean by that is, imagine Jeff Bezos building a retailer 50 years ago. It would have looked like Walmart. He would have had physical premises and he would have served local customers. And then he'd have opened an international branch and copied the model. But today, I can start an online business, and if I've got the right product, if I know how to execute perfectly, I could have every person on the planet buying my product. Now, buying a digital product, you can just do that anyway. We don't need distribution channels per se. Physical products are a little bit different. But now, in today's world, Jeff Bezos would create his retailer, and all of a sudden he's got access to a global market of 4 billion connected people. And as we head out beyond 2030, we have 7 to 8 billion people connected together, all via space-based satellite systems and so on and so forth. So this then means that if you take an individual like Jeff Bezos, in the past, he could have serviced his local community, and he'd have got, say, 1% of all their earnings. Now, I could get 1% of 4 billion people's earnings. So I'm much, much richer. But that wealth is highly concentrated to me because I own the business. Now, ultimately, when we get to 2030, the current estimates show that 1% of people on the planet will own 66% of all global wealth. That's global wealth. That's staggering. Now, this is going to lead to more social unrest because we will have the them and us. You know, we see it today. You know, we have the rich elites. You know, they're all conspiring with one another to, I don't know, turn us into consumers. But it's also we're also going to see a massive ratcheting up of fair pay and different tax campaigns as well, depending on who's in government. And in the UK, we've already seen a dramatic increase basically in shareholder activism, where shareholders are continually trying to actually vote out big executive pay packets, which compared to normal workers' pay packets have actually increased 3,000% since the 1960s. And an example of shareholder activism was Elon Musk. So Elon Musk a little while ago got awarded a potential pay packet via shares of about $38 billion or something. That just got voted down in a court in America, in Delaware, and sent him off on a Twitter rant. Now, when we have a look at improving gender equality by 2030, this is where, from an investment perspective, things get quite interesting. Because as women become, I'm not going to say as equal as men, it's dangerous for me to say that, but as women become as equal to men in terms of their access to things, their rights to things, and so on and so forth, actually, we believe that women's assets are going to grow by over 8% over the next sort of 7 years, compared to just 2.7% for men. So if you're actually a bank or you're an investment organization, are you prioritizing women over men, for example, in terms of the products that you're developing and creating and so on and so forth? So this also means that as we actually look into the future, the spending power of women increases as well, which is all good. It also means that there's an innovation bump because, ironically, companies that are run by women are generally, on average, 30% more innovative. But we still see a 15% wage gap remaining basically between men and women in the UK. And that has narrowed, but actually it's sort of stalling now. So when we actually have a look at improving gender equality, there are benefits basically to society, there are benefits to companies in those different countries, but there's also benefits to the local GDP of those countries as well. As those innovations start coming through, they start being commercialized and mature, and then eventually women-led companies end up creating bigger market opportunities for not just themselves, but for others. And then when we have a look at the rest, we've got, by 2030, an increased amount of job automation and displacement. So Sam Altman, the CEO of the OpenAI group, recently said that he believes that AGI can be defined in this way, and he thinks AGI will start appearing in 2028. AGI is the point in time when artificial intelligence outperforms all humans at all economically valuable work. That's a bit worrying. Now, we have to implement and integrate basically these artificial intelligence technologies basically into company ICT and OT stacks, but nevertheless. Now, what this actually means is if you actually think about the areas of different economies that are employing people who do economically valuable work. So you can think of banks, you can think of law firms, advisory and consulting organizations, high-tech and deep-tech firms. So companies that are making artificial intelligence models, basically companies that are doing software development and generally driving digitization, as we saw earlier. For example, that's the services industry. So as Sam Altman and his buddies create increasingly powerful artificial intelligences that are able to outperform all humans at economically valuable work, what happens to the UK, but then also global services industry? And then is that services industry then just a pawn of American big tech? Does America benefit? Does America suck up all of the dollars from the rest of the world? And when we have a look at AI, other impacts, especially in the UK, include wage depression. Now, what we mean by this is, people get upset about their wages naturally, but this is actually different. Now, for example, my son actually wrote a book using artificial intelligence, and we created lots of images for it using Midjourney. But because we used an artificial intelligence to generate the images, we didn't have to use a human. Now, if we had used a human, I estimate that we'd have had to pay them for what we did about £12,000. However, if we had used a human, I could have said, I want 5 images, and the gig economy worker on Fiverr might have said, well, for 5 images, I'll charge you £500. Now, what we mean by wage depression is this. I would have been able to go back to that gig economy worker and say, well, I can produce 100 images for $20 using Midjourney. I want a better price. And if I'd actually used the human gig economy worker, he might not have been able to charge me £500. He might have had to have charged me 100. So that's what we talk about when we talk about wage depression. But we also see wage flattening. Now, what we mean by this is we see pay scales being flattened as well. Because what we typically have within companies, we have people at the top, kind of the top 10% of earners, who are earning a lot more money than everybody else because they are superb at what they do and they sell more, for example. Then we have the people at the bottom. Now, we've been using artificial intelligence to train people who are, should we say, at the base of the organization and actually help them improve their skills and their ability to sell. And we've done such a good job that in some cases, we've increased the amount that junior salespeople sell. For example, I'm using sales as an example, by 60%. But we've trained those junior salespeople based on data from those companies' top salespeople, because the top salespeople have unique competencies. They're very charismatic. They can communicate very well. They know how to negotiate. They know how to find deals and close deals, all that kind of stuff. So what we do is we use an artificial intelligence to understand what makes the top performers great. And then we use artificial intelligence to create different courses and so on and so forth that help then the juniors become just as great. Now, what we mean by pay scale flattening is ordinarily if those top earners basically said, right, well, I'm going to leave because I'm offered a better job somewhere else and it's higher pay. The gap between them and the low performers is now closer. You could get rid of your top performers, save a load of money, and the people who are left within the organization are increasingly good at what they do. And then there's a question of if we're actually training artificial intelligences on the data that we get from top performers, is the value of the top performer the fact basically that we're able to analyze what they do and then use that information to train people down the spectrum better. But when we actually have a look at artificial intelligence, basically the fact of the matter is, yes, it's actually going to also automate a number of jobs, but it's also going to create jobs. So we actually see this imbalance. Now, for example, we believe that technologies like artificial intelligence will actually create more jobs in health, science, telecoms, and education. However, it will start cannibalizing and eating jobs, basically in the finance, government, transportation, and manufacturing industries. Now, again, some of these are service industries, especially the finance industry. So when we actually have a look at the impact that automation will actually have on, should we say, the global workforce, it's not as straight-laced as automating a job. Inevitably, basically, we're displacing some, and then those are being moved. Other ones are being moved and created. Now, when we have a look at environmental risk, climate change, we have hit 1.4 degrees Celsius of warming. I was one of the keynote speakers at COP28, and frankly, we will blow past 1.5 C. We will probably blow past 2 degrees C. And in 2023 was the hottest and wettest year on record. So we're setting heat records all over the place. And in the UK, 64% of adults are actually worried about the climate and its impact on their health, earnings, and just general well-being. Now, it also means basically that from a UK perspective, we're going to get worse weather, if that's possible. We already have some fairly cronky weather already. But from an insurance perspective, because we have worse weather, our insurance premiums are going to go up. Now, a case in point here is when we have a look at Louisiana. Now, for example, in Louisiana, albeit that they have hurricanes, as well as Florida, there are more insurance companies moving out of those states because those states are now becoming uninsurable. But in Louisiana, for example, some house premiums have actually gone up by 100% and more. In some cases, they've gone up by 500%, particularly if you live in the coastal regions. So as we get worse weather, from a bottom line, from an individual's bottom line, we're going to be paying much more in increased premiums, insurance premiums. When we have a look at environmental degradation, 40% basically of the Earth is now degraded. 3.2 billion people on the planet are affected by poor soil and planetary degradation. In the UK, 17% of our soil is degraded, and we believe that we have 100 harvests left. And that also carries things like mental and physical health impacts, because if we are growing crops in soil that is increasingly degraded, that lacks the nutrients and minerals that we actually need for our own bodies that we'd normally get from plants and crops and so on and so forth, then that has a significant health impact. Now, when we have a look at food production, weather and pests, generally 40 to 50% of all of the world's crops are destroyed by extreme weather, so droughts, floods, that kind of thing, and pests, because pests love a warm, wet world. Now, from a UK perspective, when we have a look at statistics from DEFRA, we're actually seeing a decreasing crop yields of 10%. So despite the fact that we can create crops with higher yields, so genetically modified crops, for example, with higher yields, overall in the UK, crop yields, typically from things like barley, wheat, that kind of stuff, have actually fallen by 10%. And that leads to more food insecurity. It also then leads to higher food prices, and it leads to poorer health because there is less food available, and then there is less nutritious food available for a growing population. When we have a look at the health impacts of things like heat, for example, every year we're now seeing 5 million people die from heat, excess heat. We see roughly about 7 to 8 million people dying every year from air pollution. And then from a global productivity perspective, it's estimated that climate change and all these different things, so air pollution, increased heat, that sort of stuff, is actually reducing global productivity by 2%. And these figures basically come from organizations like the World Health Organization and so on and so forth. Now, from a UK perspective, the UK was hotter last year than in any year before it, on aggregate. We saw 3,271 excess deaths from heat. We saw increased levels of suicide. Pandemics are 3 times more likely in this environment, in these different slides that I've talked through. And it's also believed, basically based on government figures, that over 9 million working hours were lost because it was just too hot to work. Now, when we have a look at the rest, the other things, the cost of climate resilience, basically when we get to 2030, is estimated to be 4.3 trillion per year in terms of the investment needed to protect our cities and societies, basically from the ravages of climate change and extreme weather and sea level rises and everything else. Now, when we actually have a look at that from a UK impact, at the moment, we need to spend about 1.1% of UK GDP on, should we say, resilient infrastructure, climate resilience, and climate resilient initiatives. Easy for me to say. But by 2050, it's estimated that with current trajectories, we're going to have to spend 3.3% of UK GDP on climate resilience. That's obviously going to have a significant impact on agriculture, health, and real estate. And then when we have a look at things like water scarcity at a global level, fresh water demand, it's estimated, will outstrip global supply. So this is fresh water, bearing in mind that only 0.5% of the world's water is available to humans and agriculture as fresh water. By 2030, it's estimated that fresh water demand globally will outstrip supply by 40%, and that's coming from the United Nations. When we have a look at it from a UK perspective, we already see roughly 7 out of 17 UK regions under water stress, where it's a bit of a problem. But we actually believe that there are going to be 12 regions in the UK that are under high levels of water stress by 2040. Now, if you have a look across Europe, I do a lot of work in Spain, for example, and in Spain, by 2040, 2050, there are certain water utility companies that are talking about the aridification of Spain and parts of Spain turning into a desert by 2040, 2050, because they see the aquifers running historically low, water reclamation systems basically aren't doing a particularly decent job, and so on and so forth. But also from a UK perspective, if we have more regions of the UK under high levels of water stress in the future, then the UK government, and any government, will need to spend much more money investing in water-based infrastructure. Now, in China, for example, they've been investing billions in projects to actually take water from northern China to southern China and then back again. So we need huge investment in water infrastructure. But that then means that we're going to be paying more for our water anyway, because the cost of that infrastructure investment has got to be recouped somehow. When we have a look at sea level rise, basically by 2050-ish, it's estimated 40 megacities are going to be put at risk. That's about 800 million people that are impacted, that then need to leave those areas and migrate to other parts of the world. In the UK, increased sea levels by 2050 mean that 1 in 6 properties are at flood risk, and we think that 200,000 properties are actually going to be underwater in terms of gone. UK's perspective, again, 15% of the UK coastline is actually at risk of being flooded by 2050. And then, of course, from a UK perspective, people who are living on the coast or in watery areas at the moment will end up having to move inland. So we will actually again see quite a lot of societal displacement. When we have a look at political risks, where do we want to go with this one? We increasingly see the rise of a multipolar world. We see the rise of China, India, the BRICS, the global south as well. And when we have a look at the BRICS represent about 45% of all the world's GDP and about the same amount of the world's consumers. Now, from a UK perspective, as we start seeing a multipolar world, as we see the BRICS actually sort of up and coming, from the UK's perspective, on the one hand, basically there is the possibility that we are going to strategically start decoupling from different countries around the world. We've seen that basically with countries and China, for example. So it's not just the UK decoupling, it's lots of countries decoupling, and it's a bit of a deeper conversation, to be honest. But this is also where, from a UK perspective, we will actually look at de-risking our relationships with the countries that we are reliant on and or partner with and or source from. And increasingly, from the UK perspective, we are going to be expected to pick sides. Are we with China or against? Are we frenemies? What are we doing there? You know, and so on and so forth. But in the meanwhile, we're seeing the rise of connector economies. So connector economies are places like Poland, the UAE and parts of the Middle East, as well as Mexico. So while the vast majority of countries on the planet will be forced to some degree to choose who their friends are in this new world order, there will be economies that just sit on the fence and they play both sides. And that's one of the reasons why when we look at Mexico, Mexico has seen huge amounts of investment from both American companies, but also Chinese companies as well. And that's where I think when you have a look at the Middle East, I think that's where the Middle East is going to start playing. They're going to start playing as a connector set of economies. And then you've got India, which is biding its time. Now, from a political risk as well, we have hard and soft power. So as we move from a country that's from a world that's dominated by America to a world that is really dominated or more dominated by China and then obviously the BRICS. From a Chinese perspective, we see huge military buildups. Now, we've seen huge military buildups in NATO. We've seen huge military buildups in America, huge military buildups in China. We're seeing huge military buildups basically through Asia-Pac. Japan basically is doing a huge military buildup as well. The fact of the matter is that when you start moving from one global status quo to another, so from a hegemony to a multipolar world, you end up with tensions because the old world order doesn't want to give up without a fight, hopefully a metaphorical fight. So this is where we're seeing military buildups around the world and huge numbers of territorial tensions. And this is whether it's India and China, whether it's China and the South China Sea, basically, I mean, you name it. We also have soft power plays. Now, I think soft power plays are highly underrated. China is very good at soft power plays. Russia used to be very good at soft power plays. And what we mean by this, and every country does a soft power play, you know, what we mean by soft power plays is I find ways to gently encourage you to be my friend, or at least not my enemy. Now, when we have a look at soft power plays, there are people that look at the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is a $1 to $2 trillion project. The European Union have announced their own sort of $500 billion Belt and Road Initiative, which is predominantly focused on Africa. An example of a soft power play is I give you money to build a port, and because I've given you money to build a port, I would expect you to take my technology stack. So Chinese 5G, not Western 5G, that kind of stuff. But also when it comes to important votes in, for example, the United Nations Security Council or just the UN or elsewhere in the standards bodies, I certainly hope that I can count on your support. Soft power plays are massively underrated from a company perspective, a government perspective, and a global perspective. And the vast majority of politicians that I speak to don't see them kindly. Now, we're also seeing the world align ideologically. So we see increasingly autocratic and authoritarian regimes aligning ideologically with one another. and democracies aligning with one another. But we're also seeing a variety of different pivots. So, for example, when we have a look at Nigeria and certain African states, we're seeing a pivot away from colonial roots. So we've seen this, for example, with France, where there's been quite a big backlash basically against the colonizer France in different parts of Africa. And when we have a look at some of these anti-colonial pivots, in some cases, some of these countries are actually going to Russia's literal bosom. And then we have the concept of birds of a feather flocking together. So increasingly, we're seeing the world align ideologically as well. Then we have resource weaponization, because as we see these growing political tensions, I have something you want, and if you're not nice to me, like rare earth metals, I'm going to restrict the supply of this thing that you need, this thing that is critical to everything that you do, and you can't do anything about it. So we're seeing, for example, in the US, the United States government keeps putting blacklists on Chinese companies and export bans of things like GPUs, NVIDIA GPUs, to Chinese companies. We see China retaliating with rare earth metal weaponization. We're seeing the rise of protectionism because, frankly, if we are starting to weaponize things like lithium, etc., and if you can't have my lithium, then I need to find it elsewhere, or I need an alternative. So we're seeing the rise of protectionism, where all of a sudden I realized that my supply chain was pegged to a country that is not my friend, you know, maybe not an enemy, but not my friend. And I need to make sure that I have everything that I need as a country to protect our businesses, our industries, and our society. So, and then obviously we're seeing tariffs. And if we have a look at Trump, for example, Trump has recently said that if he gets back in, he very much likes the idea of 60% tariffs on China. I can't imagine that that is going to go down well at all with really anybody. Although there will be some people that probably quite like it. And then when we have a look at the rest, other political risks, we've got fragile government. I mean, the United States, can we really say that the United States government actually works? Whatever the Democrats think is good, the Republicans think is bad. Whatever the Republicans think is good, the Democrats think is bad. So we have incredibly polarized societies. Now, from a democracy perspective, democracy is in decline. Yeah. However, when we actually have a look at the real impact, basically, of polarized government, the only people that actually lose is the people whose country is locked. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, we had Barack Obama, who put in a variety of different science, technology, and innovation initiatives over a course of 8 years. President Trump came in, reversed a lot of that. So by the end of President Trump's term, the US had lost almost 12 years worth of progress. That allowed China to catch up and actually overtake in quite a lot of different areas. But if you have a fragile government, if you have a government that fundamentally cannot agree, and if you have people in opposition who cannot agree, then you don't pass new laws, you don't pass new legislation and policies, which means you don't do anything, which basically means that as a government, functionally, you are useless. And when you have a look at that country's enemies or frenemies, depending how we're phrasing that, that is brilliant. So by being able to turn societies on one another and actually create an environment of fragile government, the only people that are winning are the frenemies and enemies. Then when we have a look at societal risks, we have aging populations globally, which means that younger people are going to be faced with larger tax burdens. As we start living longer, so the average global age is now 84, keeps edging up, except in America where it's actually going down, which is a different story, mainly because of non-contagious factors. So that's poor lifestyle, poor diet, and so on and so forth, high cost of healthcare in the US. This also introduces pension and savings risks, because if you're living longer and you saved enough money because you thought that come the age of 85 or 90, you're going to kick the bucket, but actually you're living to 100, there's risks. Increasingly, we live in an algorithmic society. Now, if you think about everything that you've done today, artificial intelligence is little sticky fingers. It's all over the place. The news feeds that you have been consuming, that was pushed to you by an AI. If you're on dating apps, your future love interest has been pushed to you by an AI. If you're driven somewhere, your route has been picked by an AI. If you've gone for a bank loan or a mortgage, you've been approved or denied by an AI. The machine says yes, the machine says no. But when we have a look at the algorithmic society, AI is inherently biased. It's subject to making stuff up, hallucinations in OpenAI's terms. When we talk about artificial intelligence ethics, whose ethics are we going to bake into it? Adolf Hitler's or Mahatma Gandhi's? You know, there is consensus that artificial intelligence needs to be developed along ethical lines, but whose ethics? Depending on the country that you're in, my ethics in the UK might be quite different to someone else's ethics, basically in a different part of the world. Not going to name names. Rightly or wrongly. That's it. So when we actually have a look at our algorithmic society, increasingly we are all being manipulated and controlled and influenced by the little black box that is artificial intelligence. And that is only going to get worse in the future and more pervasive in the future. So this influences everything, and this really isn't being talked about enough as a risk. Increasingly, because of all of these different things that I've talked about, we see the rise of more protests because the cost of living is high, because life is tough, because life is increasingly polarized. We have more riots, we have more activism, we have more strikes. As a society, increasingly, we have people who are worried. We have people who don't want to open up to others. We have people who don't even want to debate their own point of view with other people because they're afraid basically of the outcome. So societally, we are already in the place where children are much less likely to voice their own opinions and talk to their peers about those opinions for fear of being shot down. That is wrong. That is wrong on every level. And then when we have a look at weaponized societies, cognitive infrastructure attacks. So these are misinformation and disinformation campaigns, but what's been most interesting to me over the past year is that governments have actually, from a cyber perspective, given these campaigns a name, and they are saying now, for example, in the UK, that increasingly state-sponsored actors are attacking the cognitive infrastructure of the UK and other countries. And let's face it, we know this is the new battleground, because if I can manipulate the algorithms, and the Chinese are fantastic at manipulating algorithms, mainly from an e-commerce and retail perspective. It's a different conversation. You know, this is always can always be fairly highly fueled if not careful. When we talk about being able to manipulate algorithms, there are some countries that are just superb at it, you know, for legitimate reasons. And then nefarious actors are then able to use some of those same tactics to shove a load of junk basically into your news feed. And when we have a look at how we weaponize society, you're not going to believe the extreme piece of news. You're going to likely believe the piece of news that sits in the grey. For example, if I said to you, I've just seen news that President Trump has just married Kim Jong-il, you know, of North Korea, basically you say, well, I think that's fake news. If I said to you, he's just launched a nuclear attack against North Korea, you go, well, that could be fake news. But if I said, I just heard that he's just moved the 7th Fleet basically off of the North Korean peninsula, you might believe that. So while that's one way to crash the South Korean stock market right there for you and tank Samsung stock, increasingly we are in a state of psychological warfare. The CIA called it PSYOPs. It's a 1940s tactic. It's been around basically for centuries, if not millennia. But increasingly, our increasingly digital and connected society is being weaponized and actually shoved back in our faces in ways that we just simply do not want. And if you're interested in this particular topic, then ping me so we can have conversations about countermeasures and how we actually try to minimize the impact of weaponized information. And when we have a look at polarized societies, increasingly society is closed-minded and we're swinging right. We've seen that across Europe, we've seen that across the US. Now, when we have a look at swinging right, it's actually a little bit more than that. When times are good, democracies historically have shown that they vote in people who are visionary progressive leaders. Times are good, you can point to a golden age and, we follow the visionary leader, over the hills and beyond. However, when times are tough, and we've seen this pattern over the past 100 years, when times are tough, people elect a strongman leader or woman. And someone who says, there's a big enemy over there and we're going to crush them, and etc., etc. And so that's actually why, when we have a look at things from a psychological perspective, quite a lot of countries around the world basically are actually swinging right. Again, there's always more to these conversations. Feel free to DM me if you like, and we can have a chat. And then we've got technology risk, just a simple slide. Lots of people fear technology-led disruption, whether it's a CEO, whether it's a government, even whether it's me. That's it, because technology is increasingly science fiction-like. It's increasingly pervasive, and it's increasingly super exponential in its capabilities and performance. Now, when we have a look at AI, and the cyber threat, the cost of attacking you, the cost of me developing malware, for example, and then launching an attack against you as an individual, a business, or a government, is increasingly dropping to zero on everything. It's low cost to make malware and find and buy weaponized exploits now. It's low risk because, frankly, attribution in the cyberspace sucks. So the likelihood that you're going to find me is really low. And then even if you do find me, if I'm actually sitting in a country like Russia or different parts of Africa, you can't arrest me anyway because I'm out of your jurisdiction. So, I can stick two fingers up at you there. But it's also high reward because if it's costing me less to create an attack, less to run an attack, and the likelihood of being found and arrested and imprisoned is low, and I can get $1,000 from you. Or in one case, we saw a criminal using deepfake technology. They used deepfake video of a CEO on a conference call. This particular criminal then created a set of deepfakes for other people within this CFO's company. And on this call, the CEO of this company, deepfake bloke, said, transfer $250,000. And the CFO transferred the money. And we also saw another similar play using deepfakes that recently cost a Japanese company $250 million. So I can create deepfakes, I can do all kinds of different things. But anyway, this is a significant slide. We also estimate at the moment, basically, that since 2018, the amount of revenues that serious organized crime have actually accrued from cyber-related attacks and activities is $1.2 trillion. That's up by $600 billion since 2018. It's a staggering amount. And we also estimate through tax receipts and sort of, different, Interpol, different tax authorities and everything else for a variety of different reasons, because this is hard to track. It's also estimated that serious organized crime at the moment as an industry is pulling in over $6 trillion. And last year alone, it's also believed that cybercrime influenced and impacted $7 trillion of the global economy. And cybercrime is just going to be doing this. So when we have a look, for example, at some stats from 2022, we saw 493 million ransomware attacks, for heaven's sake. We saw 5.5 billion malware attacks. I mean, these numbers are off the charts. JP Morgan every day gets 45 million attacks, they say, against their infrastructure. When you have a look at the UAE's National Security Agency says that the UAE government at the moment, to compare, is actually seeing about 50,000 attacks per day. That's it. So JP Morgan, way up here, UAE basically down here at the moment, which is better for the UAE, let's face it. But also, when we have a look at ransomware, the vast majority of insurance companies that I work with are saying they just won't insure it any longer, or they won't insure against it any longer, because it's increasingly easy to do, to pull off, basically, and the damage is too much. Yeah, when we have a look at quantum computing, so really this is when we get to 1,000 qubit quantum computer that has a high level of accuracy, which is really sort of 2028 to 2030. IBM's doing some good stuff here. It's estimated that 70% of all encryption will be completely useless. So if you imagine the encryption, the 256 AES encryption that your company's using, gone. And we can crack 4096-bit encryption using a quantum computer in about 8 to 12 hours. So when we have a look at encryption as a risk, that's a big risk in the future, and it's coming now. I've already said about this, we can use platforms like DarkBERT and DarkGPT. So if you think about OpenAI, but the evil versions, to create malware and exploits in minutes. So I just type into DarkBERT, which was trained on dark web data, create malware to attack Walmart or create whatever it is I'm up to attack something, and it'll do the code, and then it'll package it up, and then it'll also tell you how to go and execute it and go and do whatever it is that you want to do. When we have a look at AIs, we're seeing the rise of robo-hackers. So these are semi-autonomous or fully autonomous weaponized artificial intelligences that can scan millions of lines of code in a minute, identify an exploit or a vulnerability, and then go and attack it. And then we have poisoned data sets. So just by manipulating open source data sets, if I adjust a couple of pixels, for example, in pictures, not only can I get your artificial intelligence to do things that it shouldn't, I can also put backdoors into it, but I can also completely destroy it and make it useless. So as more and more companies around the world start using open source data sets and other data sets to train their artificial intelligences, what I'm increasingly seeing is it is easier than ever before to completely destroy and or render useless those artificial intelligence models. Then we come back to the algorithmic society, and those corrupted artificial intelligence models are deciding whether or not I can buy a car, get a mortgage, etc., etc. And then we have this. So a little while ago, Barracuda's email gateways suffered a tar file attack. So tar files are a kind of format. And people aren't really sure how this actually happened, but Barracuda's gateways were infected with malware, and Barracuda said to all of its customers, we advise you to eradicate all of the software from your gateways. Customers did a full reset, gateways came back up, malware was still there. Barracuda ended up having to advise its customers to basically put its email gateways into the bins because they were not able to get the malware off of their gateways even when those gateways were formatted. Because normally if you get a virus or whatever it happens to be, if you format everything, then you just reinstall everything and the systems come back up. This was the very first example that Krebs, for example, has actually seen of malware bricking hardware. Now imagine this in a smart city scenario. So I was in Saudi Arabia a little while ago. If you imagine this kind of thing or this kind of capability against NEOM, I mean, you have a $500 billion set of bricks as opposed to a $500 billion city or $500 billion smart city. So we are now at the end, thankfully, because my legs are giving out. When we have a look at the future is full of risks. There are lots of solutions to these different things, but this presentation has been specifically about tying global trends and then trying to understand what do these trends mean, not just to us, but what do these trends mean to one another? How do they directly relate to one another or indirectly influence one another? And then how do we figure out, what do we do? If this is all the information we get given, what does good look like? And I always say, when you're actually exploring the future, firstly, expand your horizons like you just have. So don't just look in your own swim lane or your own industry. Go broad. Explore. Explore the obvious things. Seek out the things that are not obvious. And then once you've found different things, different concepts, innovations, different technologies and trends that you're interested in, for whatever reason, experiment with them. And if you want to actually experiment, then you can download some of my strategic foresight codexes. So I've got 3 strategic foresight programs. One of them you can run in 60 minutes. Other ones, let's say, are how to basically build an entire company from scratch. So that's a bit of a monster. But again, if you go to the 311institute.com website, or you go to this little QR code here, you can download all kinds of goodies, all kinds of free books, free posters on everything that I've discussed here. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I know that was actually very involving. I know it was very long. That's it. But I hope you learned some new things. I hope it helped you see the world in a slightly different way. I hoped it opened your mind to thinking in new ways and the art of the possible. I hope it showed you some of the risks that we actually face and how everything is interrelated. And if you are looking for solutions, just DM me. We do have solutions. Some are easier than others though. So anyway, that's it from me. Take care and goodbye.